Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 20 of season 2 of Babylon 5, The Long Twilight Struggle. We start unusually on Centauri Prime, with Londo meeting Reefer, who helps himself to the Emperor's throne no less, as is the Emperor is out basking in the almost sincere adulation of his people. The royal court is more than happy without him. Interestingly, Londo doesn't take long before calling out the death of his friend in knives, asking how many more are lined up, with Reefer responding in characteristically nonchalant manner. Londo asks why he has been summoned, and Reefer tells him that the war that began 6 months ago is almost at an end, and Londo will be the architect of their victory. On the station, Delenn is meditating when a glow lights her face and she smiles, saying, "Hello, dear friend." Corwin picks up an energy spike from S03, and as Ivanova interrupts Sheridan's shower, Dral in turn appears in holographic form to Sheridan, apologising for the interruption. So Dral has been in charge of the Great Machine since A Voice in the Wilderness, the first season 2-parter. He's been rejuvenated by the machine, and now has a more youthful appearance than he did previously, and is quite cheeky with it, to Sheridan's bemusement. He invites Sheridan down for a visit whenever is most convenient, but suggests that it be soon, and tells him he can bring one other. He'll know who. In Jakar's quarters, a Narn commander, war leader Justen, outlines their recent losses to the Centauri, an entire sector gone in 7 days. His account differs from the reports Jakar has seen, but this has been intentional. The reality is that they are massively on the back foot, pushed further back than they've been for 30 years. So what Justen is proposing is a massive strike on a Centauri supply world on Gorash 7 to try and make the Centauri think twice, believing a new offensive might be imminent. In that pause, Jakar notes that they would have a chance to bolster their defences, and Justen believes that it might make the Centauri entirely rethink their strategy, which has been cautious as it is. Jakar is concerned that committing so much force could leave their homeworld vulnerable, but Justen sees that window of vulnerability as being very small, and the alternative is to keep fighting a losing battle. He feels that they have to act quickly to force a change in Centauri mindset. It turns out Jakar is his nephew, and he tells him that his role on B5 could be worth more than a fleet of ships in the long run. The background soundtrack is less than encouraging, because this is clearly a move born out of desperation. Delenn catches up with a hurrying Sheridan, saying he appeared to her as well, and they should get going if Sheridan is in such a hurry. Reefer and Londo discuss intercepted intelligence about the attack on Gorash, Londo questioning its validity. Reefer, however, believes it sounds just desperate enough to be true, yet having won some generals over, he's not proposing to defend against it. He wants Londo's friends to do that, whilst his allies launch an all-out assault on the Narn homeworld itself. Londo thinks this is madness, that any invasion attempt would be suicidal. Reefer counters that he's not talking about invasion. He's going to use mass drivers to flatten the planet so they can walk in. Londo protests, saying they are universally outlawed. "We have treaties, ink on a page." And there we have the difference between Londo and Reefer. Londo still has some desire to maintain a respectable republic, whilst Reefer just wants power at all cost. Not for nothing was he fondling the Emperor's throne. And he's trying to sell Londo on the idea that this assault will save Centauri lives, seeing his reluctance to commit to it. Londo sees now that things have moved very suddenly and are spiralling out of his control, and that he was the trigger for it all. So here he stands, caught in the crosshairs, and he acquiesces, but says this is the last request he will make of his associates. If the Centauri are to rise, they must do it on their own after this. Reefer says after this there will no longer be a need for their assistance. Neither of them really seem to buy that, of course. Reefer says that by the time he returns to the station, the war will be won. On the station, Garibaldi is decidedly suspect about Dral's message and appearance, but Ivanova confirms that the message did indeed originate miles underground on Epsilon 3, so Sheridan decides it's time to go and visit the neighbours, with Delenn. Back on Centauri Prime, it turns out Reefer has booked seats on the Valeria for he and Londo, so they can be at the vanguard of the assault on the Narn homeworld. Clearly not a prospect that Londo finds enticing, just another example of him getting swept along by events. Sheridan's launched out to Epsilon 3 in a shuttle. Jakar responds to Franklin, calling him to Medlab where Narn refugees from Dross are being treated. Franklin explains to Jakar that his patients have been recounting Centauri demanding to know about the Narn homeworld's defences, and Centauri warships pulling out of the areas before they had fully secured them, which as Jakar knows is not how they operate. Franklin notes that in the closing days of the Earth-Minbari War, the Minbari ignored Mars and Io and went directly for Earth. Unfortunately, Franklin's patient can no longer speak to Jakar personally because he's passed. Try as he might, Jakar cannot convince Justen to hold his assault plans, despite his misgivings, and so it proceeds. On Epsilon 3, Delenn tries out some colourful language before they meet with Drall, who, having watched the station and explored the Great Machine's capabilities for a year, is now prepared to offer his support to Sheridan, who he has been impressed by. He likes Delenn's new look. He also reveals that he knows that Sheridan has been told about the coming darkness by Delenn, and that he is aware of Sheridan's own conspiracy of light towards his own government. He says that in the long Twilight struggle that is ahead of them, he wanted them to know that there is the possibility of hope. And so in hyperspace, some 7 Jaquan-class cruisers prepare to assault Garage 7. They jump in with their fighter escorts, initially detecting no enemy ships, but then at least 4 shadow vessels phase into normal space on an attack vector. They can't bounce out because their jump engines need time to recharge, so they move to engage. They fire energy mines into the path of the shadow vessels, seemingly landing some sort of impact as they shimmer in response. Then a shadow vessel launches what I can only call a spitball of fighters that breaks apart near the Narn ships to form a mass of shadow fighters. Then their main beam weapons start opening up with their usual efficacy, cleaving Narn ships in 2. This action is interspersed with Jakar in his quarters, fervently chanting prayers with his eyes closed. 3 Narn ships focus their own beam weapons onto a single shadow ship, blowing one of its spines off, not invulnerable. Only 2 Narn capital ships remain eventually, and they finally open jump points to try and escape, but the shadow vessels charge in after them and fire their own version of energy mines to destabilise their jump points. They succeed, and unable to pull back, the last Narn ships are destroyed as they try to enter the decayed jump points. A shadow vessel docks with its damaged counterpart, and they exit the system, their mission dreadfully successful. Jakar's eyes open, and he snuffs out the candle on his table as he sits in shadow. On Epsilon 3, they are heading back to the shuttle, noting that it would be best not to mention the new alliance to Earth. Then Drall pauses, raises his hand to his head, a look of concern spreading over his face as he explains that he's detecting a number of distress calls. He says Sheridan must return immediately, he will be needed, and tells Delenn to introduce him to the others. Delenn and Drall bid each other farewell, hoping to see more of each other. As she leaves, he calls out for one Zathras. On the station, Susan tells Garibaldi that news is coming in of a Centauri assault on the Narn homeworld, and that means mass trouble on the station. Lockdown is initiated, but ISN begins broadcasting the news and hand-to-hand fighting between Narn and Centauri erupts. Ivanova reports to Sheridan on his return that there are indeed rumours of Centauri using mass drivers, when our viewpoint switches to the Narn homeworld as the massive Centauri cruisers continue their extinction-level assault on the planet as Londo watches on, his face overshadowed by one of his warships, counting the cost of his actions. As security secures the station, ISN reports that the bombardment is into its 4th day, with the Narn still refusing to surrender while their major cities and infrastructure are levelled. Even the Vorlons have joined in the condemnation of the use of mass drivers against the civilian population. The mood amongst the human population is sombre. Jakar has a sketchy comms channel open with Homeworld and is being told surrender is imminent. There is nothing more to do. He is told not to return home to his family because to do so would mean his death, and that would gain them nothing. He is probably the last of the ruling party left alive. As such, the last command from the ruling party, the Kari, is passed to him. In Sheridan's darkened office, Jakar walks in, almost painfully, and tells Captain Sheridan that he has been instructed by his government to ask him for sanctuary aboard the station. Londo is led through the station, flanked by security guards. Meeting Garibaldi in the docking area, he requests the convening of a meeting with the B5 Advisory Council and League of Non-Aligned Worlds. Garibaldi is clearly less than impressed with him. In the council chambers, Londo explains that 5 hours ago Narn unconditionally surrendered, and that the Kari is disbanded, with a new Centauri-driven provisional government to be installed. Kari members still at large are to be arrested and tried for crimes against the Centauri. a request from Earth to send observers to the trials is denied flatly. Any murder of a Centauri by a Narn will result in 500 Narn deaths, including the perpetrator's family. And the killer blow, as Narn is now a protectorate of the Centauri Empire, it chooses how it is represented, and consequently Ambassador G'Kar is now Citizen G'Kar. However, Sheridan blocks Londo's demand for G'Kar to be deported for trial because he has requested sanctuary. Delenn backs him. This goes against the Narn Centauri agreement, which of course Earth hasn't signed. But regardless, he no longer has diplomatic standing, and Londo ends up shouting his demand that he be removed from the council chambers immediately. There is a moment of quiet as everyone, including Kosh, waits as G'Kar slowly rises to his feet and gives a quiet, dignified speech against what has happened and the power of freedom. And he walks steadily out of the room, head held high. As Londo listens to ISN news, it seems that the Centauri may have plans for expansion beyond the recapture of the Narn homeworld. In G'Kar's quarters, Sheridan tells him that he can't imagine the council chambers without him, regardless of their disagreements in the past. He offers him his hand in friendship, with a pledge to support him any way he can. G'Kar notes that the last time he took someone's hand, they were at war 24 hours later, but he does so anyway, and forms a fist from it after Sheridan leaves. Then Sheridan is called to the conference centre, where Delenn, Garibaldi and Kosh wait for him, with a group consisting in part of uniformed rangers. Delenn and Garibaldi fill him in on the purpose of the rangers, and Delenn notes that with the end of the Narn Centauri conflict, the Great War is that much closer, and Babylon 5 must stand as a fortress of light against that war. She assigns him equal control over the rangers in their area, and he accepts this, promising to draw a line and hold it against all the parliaments of conquerors with this army of light. This is an incredibly dense episode, and it brings to an end the shifting of the scales between G'Kar and Londo, which all flows from their responses to Morden back in Season 1, of course. Back then, the Centauri were the flagging empire, their light fading in the face of a bold upstart race. Now, the Centauri are crushing the upstarts under their heel once more, as they dream of recapturing lost dominion. Londo, you feel, has in some respects gotten what he wanted, and yet he has been manipulated into it by powers that he cannot control. He wanted the Centauri to rise again, yes, but on their own merits, and there is clearly nothing meritorious about bombing a civilization back into the Stone Age, as one Earth Unlocker put it. And G'Kar, who we haven't seen much of late, suddenly back at the centre of events for all the wrong reasons, seeing the disaster unfolding, but just like Londo, unable to avoid it. Even now, fates intertwined. Does he share some blame? Should he have put two and two together and realised that the Centauri had to be getting help from the very creatures he's been warning the others about since the start of the season? Maybe not. They are myths, legends. Why would a human asking a question have anything to do with them? Why indeed? And with the culmination of the Narn Centauri conflict, Epsilon 3 returns with a surprise and more than one. Not only does Droll now have their backs in support of the Conspiracy of Light and the Army of Light, he is also working with a certain Zathras. Another callback to Season 1 and Babylon Squared. So how on earth is that going to fit into the grand scheme of things? Cannot say. You can imagine the news loops with that one back in the day. Such fun. Now, you may realise by now that I'm a fan of the way space battles are handled in this series, and oh my god, this isn't even the series finale, and we have a humdinger of a battle, even if it is tragically one-sided for the Narn. Whilst that's the point in some respects, you have to recognise that the Narn do get some licks in. The shadow ships, for all their mystery and advancements, are vulnerable to fire from the young ones. But we also have to recognise here that this is the highest number of shadow ships we've seen engaged in battle to date, and they are able to handle 7 or 8 capital ships with their fighter support. So whilst they are proven not to be invulnerable, they are still incredibly hard to stop, and they are growing in number. How will the younger races be able to counter that if they stop acting like shadows and come out to play in even greater numbers? Yes, it's an utterly crippling blow for whatever's left of the Narn fleet by the end of the episode, but it does not in any way bode well for anyone else either. We can only assume then that the Narn homeworld is basically wide open because none of their ships made it back from Garash. Even then, Reefus assembled quite the fleet of Centauri mainline battleships equipped with their mass drivers. I think the Space Dock channel has considered, and I certainly have, the feasibility of actually trying to take an entire planet from space without simultaneously destroying your prize. The Centauri know damn well they can't hope to win the planet conventionally, and imagine the cost of them trying to rebuild it to any significant degree. All they're doing is putting up a big sign on the charred remains to say, "Do not mess with us, because we generally do not care what anyone else thinks." And so they force a capitulation in one of the many ways open to a sufficiently technologically advanced race that knows it can play the bully unchallenged. Which in and of itself is telling, because the bombardment goes on for days, and apparently not even the Vorlons who protest, but who might have been able to intervene technologically, actually lift a finger to stop the bully. And so in one respect, the Babylon project fails. Yet at the same time, Draal's awakening and the explicit activation of the Rangers into Delenn and Sheridan's joint control means that the Babylon project may have a chance at stopping the greater war that Delenn and, oh so ironically, G'Kar have been warning of. So there is that hope that Draal spoke of. And finally we have G'Kar, so very, very alone at the end of the episode, yet not perhaps quite as alone as he might have feared. His speech in the council chamber is terrific, because in the face of all of Londo's bombastic speech-making, he is quiet and composed, and reminds Londo that his people broke free of the Centauri once before, when by all rights they shouldn't have been able to, and that they can teach them that lesson again. Katsoulis plays it beautifully, and again it's ironic, because in the early days of Season 1, he would have been the one showboating around in the council chamber like Londo is now, full of confidence and power. Yet here, with a shoe on the other foot, he is perhaps still the greater of the two, because the Narn have always forged their own path through sheer strength of will, where Londo is standing on the shoulders of his dark allies. So yes, Londo has got his wish, the Centauri get the win. But as he notes to Reefer, it's already cost him an old friend, and perhaps some part of his soul too, as he's starting to see just what type of deal he's really made with Morden. And now it seems the Centauri war machine is ready to march on. That's not really what he had in mind, yet what did he think the outcome was going to be ultimately? He now has a lot weighing on him, and he will have lost many former friends as a result too. Is people being afraid of you the same thing as being respected? I think JMS could have named the season after this episode. I'm sure it must have been in contention. Somehow, inside of 30 minutes, he manages to finish the Narn Centauri conflict in a fashion that is completely believable in universe, with 2 episodes still left in play, while simultaneously getting Sheridan involved with Epsilon 3 out of the blue, when we've not seen it at all this series, and since Voice in the Wilderness. That's forward planning, folks, which is, of course, the whole reason this series and JMS get to mess with your head so much. Sure, you can do this sort of stuff on an ad hoc basis, and then hit the reset button, but Babylon 5 chucked that rulebook out of the window. This will undoubtedly be a long one by the time I'm finished, so I hope the YouTube algorithms will be kind, and not think I'm trying to rip off the episode in video format. That can be a thing when I run this long. But I can't really skimp on these episodes. They form the backbone of the series, so I would be doing myself and JMS a disservice if I did so. Stay tuned to this channel, and we'll see what's in the tubes for the final 2 episodes of Season 2.